Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. I'm going to figure out a different way to say that every time, I promise. Now today I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I'm going to dip into my historical collection and show you how I paint my American soldiers for World War II era stuff. So bolt action in particular, but if you play Chain of Command or anything like that, then this might help you too. Now for me, historical wargaming, part of the appeal is in the research. So there is a lot of detail to consider when you're looking at when you want to set your troops, what uniforms they would be wearing, so on and so forth. Finding the right combination of colors and materials for your troops can be a little bit of a challenge, but like I said, for me that's part of the fun. Now I've got here today two metal figures. These are from Black Tree Miniatures, and they are pretty cool. The sculpts are clean, they got a lot of detail, but these guys come with quite a high number of the M43 jacket, which is not the fella I'm holding, which is the longer jacket. The 43 jacket here, you see it goes down to the thighs and it has these pockets there as well. Okay, I'm not going to paint this guy today, but if you do want to paint any of these jackets, and especially with Black Tree, they'll send you quite a few figures with this, they will be green, okay, or sort of a drab green color, rather than the beige that we're going to paint most of this other miniature. So just something to bear in mind. Now the webbing changes color through the course of the war, their helmets get slightly more green, trousers go from brown wool to green, but like I said, I'll leave you to sort that out. What I'm going to do today is a fairly generic, well, as much as anything from the Second World War can be generic, but this is going to be a standard sort of infantry figure, and his uniform would be relevant through most of the war. You know, unless you're doing very early war, this is the sort of stuff that we'll see all the way through to the end of 45. So where possible, I'm actually going to use some of the Vallejo paints, but I've got here their Games Workshop equivalents, so if that's what you've got at home, then you can paint along without having to worry too much about the color matching. Now for the jacket, and you can see how I've base coated him as well, or undercoated rather. The jacket itself, I'm going to use Zandri dust. So I've base coated him with, or undercoated him with that, and then I've given him a little bit of that out of the pot just to make sure that I haven't missed anywhere and that the finish is going to be smooth when it comes time to paint it. For his trousers, I'm going to use flat brown, or flat earth, sorry, not flat brown. We're going to use flat brown later. Flat earth from Vallejo. Now, honourable mention to Steel Legion Drab from Games Workshop. That would be the closest match I can think of for that, and I've seen that on a few miniatures. It looks pretty good. For his webbing, I'm going to use Green Grey from Vallejo. Now, this is starting to get a little further into the war. I think it was around 1943 that the green webbing became more prevalent. As ever, don't quote me on this. I thoroughly encourage you to go and check all this information out yourselves. But I'm going to use green grey. You can also use either khaki. Now this is a Flames of War branded, but it is Vallejo paint, just literally khaki. Or one that I quite like, and I'm going to use a little of this on some of this webbing, is buff. I never get sick of saying buff. What a great colour. Buff. Okay. So, like I said, the majority of his webbing, I'm going to do green grey, but khaki or buff works as well. Deathworld Forest from Citadel would be the closest match I can think of for that. And then for any wood, I'm going to do flat brown. Mornfang brown from Citadel. Metal bits and pieces like that, I will leave you to figure out which ones you like to use. I like to use quite a dark metal because you find a lot of material from this era is designed that it doesn't shine. So most of the metal stuff I am going to paint black and then highlight with a metallic color because I want it to look a little bit more realistic. To start out though, once we've got his base coat finished, it's time to go ahead. I'll do the trousers first. Okay, it's the second largest area of color, and it's dead simple. So I've got here my little dab of Vallejo paint, and you see that's a little bit thicker than the base paints from Citadel tend to be. So I'm going to just dab in some water as I need it. And then once I'm happy with the consistency, all it is just bucketing this on his trousers. This is not a difficult step. You want to try and avoid the edges of his jacket as much as you can, because that saves you any time when it comes to cleaning up later. Same too with his gaiters around his boots here. You don't want to be covering those either. So I'm going to finish this off and then we'll go on to the next step. The base coat for the trousers is applied, and I've given him a couple of thin coats of that just to make sure I've got a nice solid colour. Now I'm going to go ahead and do all of the webbing. Now like I mentioned, I do want to do, there is an ammo bandolier he's got around his shoulder here, and I'm going to do that in this buff colour. So the steps are exactly the same, but we'll just start off a little bit of water and start with this green-grey and do all of his belt and his webbing. So you see this is just taking your time, going around. Now the beautiful thing with green-grey is that it actually covers really well, so you tend not to need to go back and do a second coat. So I'm going to finish that off and I'll do that bandolier and buff at the same time. The green-grey and the buff are both applied, and you can see that the green-grey does dry a little darker than it looks when it goes on. So don't worry too much if you get that out of the pot first and it seems a little bit much. Now, same too with that buff. That looks really yellow at the moment, but I promise that's going to look much more reasonable once it's had a wash. So now it's up to you whether you want to do the wood or the skin first. Now, personally, I like to do this flesh because it's a little easier to tidy up around hands and what have you with your wood colour than the reverse. So I'm going to do the skin now. You can use any old colour that you like to do skin. I'm going to do a couple of coats of Cadian Fleshtone, and we'll come back and see how that looks. A couple of thin coats of Cadian Fleshtone later, and he's ready, for the next step. Now I just want to point out one thing here is if you look in between his arm and his gun, on these old metal miniatures, you'll find that sometimes the way that they're cast just means you can't get these gaps, clear gaps between two places like you should have in reality. Now, if I wanted to, I could spend a bit of time with a drill and a file and get some of that out, but then I'd essentially have to fill in that detail that I was going to haul away from anyway. So I recommend normally just do that the same color as the uniform is going to be, because it won't stand out too much. It's just something to bear in mind when you come time to do these metal miniatures. With the gun being so close to his body there, it might be tempting to go ahead and put some of that in there, but I think that'll be a little bit more conspicuous. So I'm going to leave it the same color as his uniform jacket, but now we'll get on to the wood. So I'm going to use flat brown, do his gun casing in that, and as well, don't forget this little, I think it's an entrenching tool handle, that's the one. So, flat brown. Now I love flat brown, it's a lovely warm brown tone. I will use it given any excuse. So, just a little bit of water. And just coat the whole gun. Like, you don't need to be careful about where the metal work is on this. You just want to get in and cover all of it. Because if you miss anything with this, it'll make it stand out all the more when it comes time to do the metal bits. And every time I'm concentrating, I'm whispering. But this won't take me a second. I'll come back when this is finished. His rifle and his entrenching tool are both complete. Now I'm going to do his helmet. So I just want to do a quick touch on different colors you could use for this. Now, the most broadly applicable I want to use all the time is brown violet, which is a lovely shade of green. Go figure. The closest one to this is Castellan green, or Castellan green from Citadel. Now, these are not perfect matches. Of all the ones that I've recommended you swap out for so far, these two greens are the hardest ones to find a proper color match in the Citadel range for. So just be aware of that. But I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to use brown violet for the helmet. Now, because of the fact that these are going to be washed and then highlighted, brown violet's a great one for this because it's a little bit darker than it needs to be, I think, which really helps accentuate what we're going to do with it later. So nothing too complicated here. There we have the helmet finished. Not too hard, that one. Now, while I was waiting for that to dry, I actually popped on Google and did a little bit of research just to double check what I was up to, and I found out these jackets, they were nicknamed the Parson jackets, parsons jackets I should say, and these were phased in by the army around 1941 to replace their old World War I stocks. But by 1943 they were already being swapped out in favour of those longer jackets, the 1943 jackets. So, because so many of them were made, they continued being distributed, and like I said, this fella, he'd be suitable for most of the war. So look at that, easy as that. Just a little bit of Google Foo and some Wikipedia. All the answers you need right there. So what I'm going to do next is any of the leather details. So the strap that he's got on his gun, I'll do his boots at the same time, and the strap across his helmet. This will just take a couple of seconds. So now for the boots, the strap on his gun and across his helmet, I'm going to use Vallejo's Leather Brown. Now this won't take too long, this is fairly simple, and as with most of these things, over a bright undercoat or base coat, you want to make sure you're just going to give these a couple of thin coats to make sure you have a solid colour. So bring my fella up here, and then if your model's wearing gaiters, you want to spend a second just to leave that little gap where the gaiter hooks under the boot. And it's such a minor detail, I don't think you'll ever see it once the model's based, but I like to leave it there just for completion's sake. So I'm going to do all those leather details now, and we'll come back once those are finished. So with those brown elements complete, this model's almost finished. The last thing I'm going to do before he gets his wash is to do any metal elements that are going to be on his gun. Now I'm going to paint those black, and when we come back to highlight them, I'm then going to edge them with a little bit of a metallic colour. So he's carrying good old M1 Garand, so it's not going to take me too long to look up on Wikipedia or anything like that how to highlight this. So all those base coats have had plenty of time to dry, and he's ready for his wash. All of that shading will really make the colour stand out, and that detail is going to be all that much deeper. Now, to be truthful, ordinarily on my metal miniatures like this fella here, I would use the Strong Tone Dip from Army Painter. But instead today I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade for two main reasons. One, the colour is almost identical, and this is the reason why you will see if I've got plastic and metal miniatures in the same army, the plastic guys are just Agrax Earthshade. It's much of a much. But two is also the convenience factor. This is going to take me just a couple of minutes. If I was prepared and I was doing a large batch of these, like a full 10-man squad, there's no question I'd use the dip. Now there is a video here on the channel about how to go about using that, but the wash is nice and simple. So let's go ahead, just prep my brush, and as ever you can get a ton of this stuff, and we're just going to bucket it on and start moving it around the model. Now, as always, you want to make sure that you are really getting it into the recesses. So a brush that's got a bit of a tip to it is good to really jam it in there. And we'll just go around and coat the whole miniature in Agrax Earthshade. I've given that wash plenty of time to dry, about half an hour, and you can see what a huge difference that makes. We've gone from olive drab to olive fab. And yes, that took entirely too long to think up, and I wasn't going to let an opportunity to use it go by. So now it comes time to do our highlights. And I've got my highlight colours prepped along the bottom here with what I like to use. So for his trousers, I'm going to use US Field Drab. And that's over the top, straight over the top. I'm not going to bother putting any more flat earth over the top. I'm going to go straight from the wash to the highlights. Now these are going to be quite sharp. Like when these go on the model, they're going to be really, really stark highlights. And as I'm fond of pointing out, I like to paint armies. I like to paint stuff that's going to go on a table and be played with. So for me personally, when I've got an army on the table, I like these highlights to be visible from, however far I'm going to be standing away. If I was going to paint this for display, I'd go back and I'd paint all of the areas that I just had with the wash with a little of their base coat again. So I'd put some flat earth on the trousers, a little bit of Zandri dust on the jacket, and leave those recesses shaded, and then do the highlights. But for gaming figures, I like this real sharp contrast. Your mileage may vary, but this is how I paint things. So just that there is that difference there, and if you do want to make them look a little bit smoother, just a little of that base coat again will really help that pop. But as I was saying, highlights, trousers, US field drab. I'm going to do his jacket with Ushabti bone. This is from Citadel, these 4. The buff stuff I'm going to do with Screaming Skull. Now his green-grey, the webbing, I'm going to do with Death Guard green. And that's quite a sharp difference, but I think that's really going to look quite nice. And then any metallic bits I'm going to touch up, I'm going to do with Lead Belcher. His skin, like I normally do, I'm going to use Kislev Flesh to highlight, but let's get into that right now. So here we have just a little bit of paint on my brush, and we're going to quickly go around and, like I said, very prominent highlights. Now this doesn't take too long to do, particularly if you're not fussing around making sure everything is very, very dainty. So I like to do this if I've got a big squad. You know, if you were painting Russians or something like that, this would be the way to get them on the table really quickly. So I'll just do his trousers now, and we'll cut back in and we'll get started on his jacket after that. Once that flat earth dries, you see it's not quite as sharp on the model as you'd think when it's going on wet. There's 1 or 2 places where I think I have let that wash pool a little too much before highlighting, but hey, live and learn. And importantly, once there's 30 or so of his mates on the table with him, you're never going to see it. So next up, we're going to paint his jacket. I've got my Ushabti bone here, and this is the same procedure again, just quickly going around and picking out those edges. Same thing again, you don't need to be particularly careful with this. So anywhere that you want the fabric to look like it's catching the light, just a thin line of this. This works well along the bottom of the jacket too, just to really make that line between trousers and jacket stand out. Along his epaulets and so forth. So I'm going to finish that off now, and we'll come back, see how that looks. Same procedure here with the Screaming Skull, just on the edges of those buff. This is a slightly yellower tone than the Ushabti bone I was using for the jacket, so these won't blend together too closely, which is nice. Also, this really helps this stuff look like it's got a slightly faded effect, which is good for material that's been in service for a little while. Now with the Death Guard green on his webbing, you don't want to use much of this. In fact, most of this you could probably get away with not highlighting at all. But just to make those stand out a little bit further, I'm going to go ahead and I am going to highlight along his entrenching tool here. You'll see how Death Guard green has that slight grey tinge to it, so it matches up fairly well with the Vallejo green-grey. Now we've got our Lead Belcher to highlight the metal bits. Now with this you want to be quite sparing. You don't want this to look like the gun is really, really shiny again. So just pick out a few little details to make it look like it's catching the extreme edges of that metal. But for the most of it, you want to leave it black. So I'm just going to do the very edges of some of this material right on the top of these sections. And that is just enough that it looks really smashing on the table. Okay, a little bit cartoony, but I think that that suits the distances we're going to be seeing him on the table at. And then, last but not least, we have our Kizlet Flesh just to do the backs of his knuckles, along the tips of his fingers, and just a couple of elements to his face. So we'll just dab those on real quickly. You see I'm not being very careful with this at all. This is now in the realm of just getting him finished. Along the back of his fingers. And we'll do his nose. Oops. Oh dear. Alright. Quick tip about keeping your paint wet is you can rinse your brush off really quickly. And as long as everything underneath is dry, you can flood away paint from where you don't want it to be. So that is something to bear in mind. Check that out. What mistake did I make? Nothing. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry now, back to how it was, and then I'll finish off highlighting his face. There we have it. Now, if you do want to go ahead and highlight any of his leather parts, you can use Gawthorpe Brown. Just thin that down a little and do those edge highlights like you will with everything else. But that is finished. You can see the hubris involved when I tried to paint his face with a brush too big. So lesson learned there, do, take your time, be careful with it. But that figure there is what I'd call complete. He's not going to win you any beauty competitions. He might not win a painting competition either, if I'm perfectly honest. But once he's on the table, if I put him down there and we just focus at table length, you can still see his highlights and you can still clearly see what he is. So I'm going to go ahead and base him now, and I'll show you what he looks like with a picture at the end when everything is finished. So hopefully, guys, something in there you found useful. There might be one or two tips that you've picked up, haven't thought of before. As ever, if you have any questions, feel free, drop them in the comments. And every time, guys, make sure you enjoy the rest of your day.